If this was your last meal,
You'd probably invite Hitler, wouldn't you? But you can't really say so. Okay, right? You'd have to invite Lee Harvey Oswald. Right, okay. Settle that one once and for all. Okay. This is turning into a really strange dinner, isn't it, at this point?
tonight I have the pleasure of dining with one of my all-time favourite behavioural science heroes, who is also the chairman of Ogilvy UK. The always curious Rory Sutherland is in a class of his own.
Effectively, quite a lot of what happens to us is probably random. We're not comfortable with acknowledging that.
In true Rory style, he has me preparing one of the most interesting dishes of the series. Food defines us, but every feast must come to an end. When facing mortality, life's big questions are served. This is Last Meal, where I prepare the dish my guest would want if it were their last. For anyone at home who doesn't know who you are or has been living under a rock, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, I'm Rory Sutherland. I'm the author of a book called Alchemy. I've been the vice chairman of Ogilvy, the advertising agency in the UK, for quite some time. And I suppose my basic contention is that for all kinds of reasons, we could solve an awful lot of the world's problems if we looked at the psychological variables rather than the physical and technological ones. And I think we've got our approach out of whack. That's effectively what I mostly say. I've also weirdly become an accidental TikTok star, at least in the UK, because someone started just taking clips of me and TikTokizing them. So I now am in the slightly weird position of being a fat 58-year-old man who gets mobbed by school kids when you walk around. Slightly bizarre, unexpected.
Okay, let's move on to your last meal.
Of course.
Okay? This sets the tone for the rest of the conversation. So, Rory, your last meal is
Joy.
Halim Atbari. Do you want to tell me a little bit about Halim Atbari?
First of all, I love Indian food in every respect. I think it's magnificent. I love spicy food in general, but I think Indian is at the absolute pinnacle in terms of the kind of pantheon of world cuisines. Way above French and Italian and all that European nonsense. But I discovered this in a restaurant called Salou in Kinnerton Street in Knightsbridge. It's probably London's most expensive Indian restaurant, which may make it the most expensive Indian restaurant in the world. I had it for the first time and it was just a complete revelation. It was an epiphany. I mean, even by the pretty high standards of the place, it's just, so if I'm right, it's lamb. We can have a whole separate conversation about this, by the way.
Well, you can tell me why lamb might be important to you.
Well, Welsh, okay, you're Australian, okay, so we're from two of the world's great lamb-eating cultures.
That's right.
And people's ability to eat hot or spicy food varies enormously. So Brits, to give them their due, are pretty good, you know, whereas your typical Frenchman will be hospitalized by a chicken korma, pretty much. And so, you know, I find these patterns of cultural variation where you get, you know, strange pockets, really interesting.
If this was your last meal, what would be the place? Who would it be with? What would be the context?
It's impossible to answer it absolutely honestly, I think, because you'd probably invite Hitler, wouldn't you? But you can't really say so. Okay, right? Because you kind of want to, you know, you'd have a lot of questions to ask, okay? You'd have to invite Lee Harvey Oswald. Right. Okay. Settle that one once and for all. Okay. This is turning into a really strange dinner, isn't it, at this point? Okay.
I love these answers, though, because most people are like, oh, I'd be surrounded by family. You're like, no, let's get Lee Harvey Oswald.
No, I would have my family as well. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Just your family and
Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay. You'd have to settle that one. Absolutely.
You were really big on psychological framings and things like that, and how that affects our behavior. I'm interested to know whether you think there's a way that we can use framing to lead a better life.
Yeah, undoubtedly. I mean, I don't know I don't know how necessarily. And it's worth noting, by the way, that religions have and had significant beneficial effects. Okay, if you're purely a consequentialist, if you're a Richard Dawkins sort of truth-obsessed person, okay, you would argue that believing something that is untrue is somehow failing. Okay, now if you're a consequentialist, you'd say there are many heuristic beliefs we hold, or rules of thumb, or ways of seeing the world. For example, imagining that you're going to be judged in the afterlife, which may or may not be true, but the belief probably leads to better behavior. There's a great anthropologist called Jesse Behrens. He's written 2 books. One of them is called Perv, which is about perversion. And the other one is called Why is the Penis Shaped Like That? Okay. So if you want to read the oeuvre of Jesse Behrens, generally I'd recommend a Kindle or an audio book rather than sitting on the London Underground holding a book called Perv. Okay.
Or Why is the Penis,
Or Why is the Penis Shaped Like That? Okay. And he makes the point that although he's a complete atheist, when he gets into a taxi in a foreign country, he's glad to see religious things hanging from the rearview mirror because he doesn't necessarily believe there's a man in the sky. But if the driver of the taxi does, he's probably less likely to club him over the head and steal his wallet. Okay. Yeah. His other interesting observation is he's gay and he has a boyfriend and he's an evolutionary psychologist and anthropologist, I guess. And he said the interesting thing is, rationally, I know that jealousy is completely irrelevant in a homosexual context from an evolutionary standpoint because there's no risk of pregnancy or someone having to bring up someone else's child, etc. Nonetheless, okay, I still care at a deeply emotional level, and there's no way that I could rationalize that away. Which I think is just a really interesting understanding that we have certain components of our psychology which are kind of on the motherboard, and try as we will to rationalize. I always notice that people who are into polyamory, they go on and on and on and on about it, right?
It's like veganism.
And actually, they're trying to convince themselves. I think when people, in other words, things that we just generally believe that we don't have any internal mental conflict about, the world being round or something like that, okay? Generally, we don't feel the urge to bore our friends to death about this, this spherical globe concept, okay? Because we just accept it. Those things which we're not quite sure about, okay? And I always wonder if I did this a bit. When I left London to move to what you might call outer suburbia, I did an awful lot of evangelizing for moving out of London. And I wondered to an extent whether it was partly driven by having twins. And a little bit of that, I genuinely do believe I'm happier outside London, I think. But I think in the initial phase, a lot of that was necessary not to convince other people, it was to convince myself.
Yeah, and I often think that, how much of our life appreciation is us post-rationalizing where we already are.
Reverse engineering the reasons for where we already are, or effectively, recreating a backstory as to why we did something, for example. A lot, I think, is the answer to that question, because we have to actually, effectively, quite a lot of what happens to us is probably random. We're not comfortable with acknowledging that. So we have to construct a kind of idea of purposefulness or direction to explain where we turned out.
And it would indicate that we can do a whole lot more of that than we're already doing if we were conscious about it, I guess.
And you could do it for good. I mean, I made the point about religion, that if you believe certain things and they lead to beneficial behaviors, what's the problem? Okay. If we're being, effectively interested in the consequences. I also asked the question, and I find Dawkins very strange because I found the selfish gene one of the most amazing pieces of polemic, and I mean this in a good way, one of the most persuasive things I've ever read, which I thought was extraordinary in kind of reorienting the way I looked at the world. But I don't understand his animus to religion, because my argument would be, well, evolution doesn't care about truth. It only cares about consequences, okay? And if certain beliefs are advantageous to the survival and growth of particular groups, then it's not necessary to see those things merely as memes. they actually serve an evolutionary purpose. And you can quite easily see why a tribe which were capable of believing in, for example, divine providence or whatever it may be, would be more successful. At a very commercial level, one of the most successful commercial groups in history have undoubtedly been English Quakers. And they had a belief that your word was your bond. They didn't swear oaths. They wouldn't really sign legal documents. If two Quakers wanted to do business, they'd go, I would like to buy your chocolate factory. How much would you like? And the other Quaker would say, I'd like 20,000 guineas. And the other person would say, done. That was the end of it. Now, if you think about it, an entity which doesn't require lawyers because everybody in all their interpersonal dealings operates within a sphere of complete trust has a huge economic advantage over one which is plagued by suspicion. So that was a case purely, I'm a huge admirer of these Quaker firms. Huge admirer of Quakerism in general, because they seem to have been ahead of the curve on practically everything, from slavery to same-sex marriage to more or less everything. It's a very, very thoughtful, very interesting approach to a religion.
Egalitarian as well.
It's a very beautiful thing. Also, it comes from 17th century England, so it's great. Okay, but anyway, it's got that slight element of it is actually kind of attractive. But I remember Robert Trivers, who was really the originator of the sort of gene-centric view of evolution. I said to him, look, whether this thing is true or not is not relevant. If you're a proper empiricist, what you do is you take 5 or 6 islands, okay, and you'd put 50 Mormons on one island, and you'd put 50 hand-picked evolutionary biologists, okay, on another, and then you might put 50 people from another religion on another one. And the only question to ask is which one is still functioning as a society in 30 years' time? And Robert Trivers' answer was, my money's on the Mormons.
Interesting.
Okay, basically.
You mentioned trust before, which you tend to talk about a lot, and I find trust...
By the way, it worries me because we're creating through technology and bureaucracy. If you take Australia and the UK, one of their biggest advantages is, relatively speaking, they were high trust societies. An awful lot of things could be conducted through the benefit of the doubt without requiring kind of legal backup or paperwork or procedures, whatever. You allowed people freedom to exercise discretion, and you gave people the benefit of the doubt. And what technology is doing, and a whole bunch of other changes in the workplace, where you have these massive, great white-collar welfare schemes, which are HR and procurement and compliance and so forth, these vast, great bureaucratic excrescences, okay, are creating the inefficiencies of a low trust culture in the high trust cultures.
Yeah, they're assuming a lack of trust by their existence.
And in a way, of course, when you have an interconnected world, everything has to be calibrated to be proof against the world's most dishonest people.
If you were to have had a different life and been not in the advertising industry, what do you think you would have been well suited to? Or what do you think you would have ended up doing?
And it's a really interesting question. I thought of teaching for quite a time. And actually, in the right milieu, I could have made that work, I think. In the right place, I could have been a catastrophe. I could have made it work. I don't know. Because I actually trained as a teacher for a time before I went into advertising.
And you studied classics.
Well, what actually happened was I did a term of teaching in a school after I graduated. And I had a kind of panic attack, which is I suddenly realized if I do this now, I will have spent my whole life in education establishments, school, primary school, university, back to school. And I kind of panicked and realized, okay, I've got to get out and do something else first, even if I do this later. I mean, the great thing about the ad industry, for its many faults, and my God, we can do a separate podcast where I criticize it, okay, is it's one of very few environments where you can make a stupid suggestion and still get promoted. Okay. In most environments, you make a daft or humorous or ridiculous suggestion and you're seen as not a safe pair of hands. Whereas in the right context in this industry, David Ogilvy famously said, the best ideas arrive as jokes. And I think in our field, that's kind of, by the way, one of the things, would I have been a stand-up comedian? That's possibly, that's a conceivable, I don't think I would have made it soon enough to have survived. Okay.
Do you think you could have stuck it out? Because you know how it usually takes people 10, 15 years.
Yeah, I mean,
of
that's
bombing.
my interesting question, which is, could I have actually survived the earlier humiliations of, having bottles thrown at you in kind of basement clubs and so forth? And I think it would have, Rick Rubin told me that he was friends with Chris Rock before he was famous, okay? And he was this not very funny guy. And I said to Rick, well, how did the transformation happen? What happened? Because I asked the same question about the Beatles. They just hit complete magic. And apparently the same thing happened with Chris Rock. And I asked Rick Rubin, and he said, those are the moments where you just have to accept the existence of God. That there's a divine force at work which occasionally just blesses someone randomly.
Yeah. Is there one thing that you nerd out on in life that excites you that most people wouldn't know about?
Okay. Two things which I don't think are unrelated to the day job: cryptic crosswords. And the reason I find them so fascinating is because they're a kind of problem-solving mechanism where you deploy different methodologies. Sometimes you solve them in a flash of inspiration. Sometimes you solve them by brute force. Sometimes you go, there was a case where CPU, backwards, which is UPC, was a constituent part of the final answer, which was cupcake. Okay, this is the kind of bollocks you get in cryptic crossword. And sometimes you go, there's a UPC in this. What the hell word has UPC in it? Gosh, that could be cupcake. I nerd out over technology. My gadget, the reason I need to earn this bloody salary is basically to buy things with a plug. Okay, so I nerd out over technology and gadgets, and I buy them indiscriminately and then go through an evolutionary process where they end up in the back of the cupboard or they end up used every day. But I try everything, literally every fucking thing. The other thing is true life crime fiction, serial killer stuff, crime detection stuff. I find really fascinating. One of the book recommendations I'll give everybody is just read the whole Sherlock Holmes short stories, because they're bloody masterpieces, and you get two things from them: fantastic prose writing ability. He's not acknowledged as a great, but Kingsley Amis rightly said, in terms of clarity of English prose writing, an awful lot of things from that era are pretty unreadable now to us. But you can sit down and read Conan Doyle, and you never have to turn back a page to work out who somebody is. The absolute clarity in which he does it. But also it's what he calls the practice of thinking backwards. A lot of people are very good at saying this happened, so what's going to happen next? But there's a different mental process, which is sometimes called abductive inference, which is, this has happened, what could the prior conditions have been that led to this consequence? Okay. And that's fundamentally a more speculative and imaginative mental process than, say, deduction.
Yeah.
But it's still an essential part of the human mental it's an under-exercised part, I would argue now, of the human mental toolkit.
What's the most sensible thing anyone's ever said to you?
My grandfather had a saying, which was, something you don't need is expensive at any price. It's extremely sensible. I haven't heeded his advice at all. One thing about advertising people is we're very, very consistent and honest. Okay, people in banking, they tell their clients to go and invest in collateralized debt obligation or mortgage bonds, but when you give them a bonus of £500,000, they go and put it in like treasury bills or a high interest deposit account. They're totally inconsistent in terms of what they recommend and what they do. People in advertising are very honest. We spend our lives telling people to piss their money up the wall, but if you do give us money, we piss it up the wall. So we are at least completely consistent, Our public pronouncements are completely consistent with our private behavior. Yeah.
It's amazing. Okay. What is a belief that you hold with which many people disagree?
Oh my God. I think nicotine is great. I think that actually getting large swathes of the population to withdraw from nicotine consumption is rather like having a chunk of the population that are off their meds. Now, I can't say that, Well, I have said it. I just did. Interestingly, I've got a friend who's a really quite eminent biochemist who believes the same thing, that actually, I think that nicotine, coffee, and tea basically created the Enlightenment. Okay.
Is this to do with Sir Walter Raleigh?
Well, what it did, I think, was previously alcohol, okay, is brilliant for many things. It's not brilliant for prolonged thought or sober discussion. You need something to consume in a social setting, okay?
I agree.
You can't just sit around a table with nothing on it. It's weird.
It is weird, yeah.
So you need some props in the shape of food, drink, etc. And I think there was something insanely valuable about those things, which we've never really given them credit for.
Yeah.
Correctly, we should actually do a cost-benefit analysis with drugs, and we tend to do a cost analysis. I think when you do that analysis, by the way, I think alcohol comes out rather badly and other things come out rather better. There's a second answer, which is an outrageous opinion, which I think is right. The only two proponents of this argument are both female, okay? Do not shoot the messenger, but I think it's substantially right, which is that the correct, whatever the benefits quite rightly in terms of gender equality, okay? The creation of the double income household was one of those changes which went from being an option to an obligation. The principal beneficiaries were government, who had twice as many people to tax, okay? Property owners, because now you needed 2 salaries to buy a house. So the option of running a household on one salary basically disappeared, okay? And the unit of the household, the family, lost 35 hours of discretionary leisure every week, with no commensurate increase in living standards because the money got soaked up by property prices and by taxation. And that obviously what I'm not suggesting is that we should return to women remaining at home while men go out to work or anything like that. I'm simply saying that there are many, many things that start as an option and then they become an obligation. They become an imposition. And looked at through the lens of and Elizabeth Warren, who's one of my heroes, by the way. I never understand this. Americans regard her as bonkers, but she always strikes me as an absolute beacon of sanity. She's a Democratic senator for Massachusetts. Okay.
Yeah, I remember she ran a couple of...
And she ran, I think she was a potential presidential candidate. Yeah. And she's incredibly interesting. The other person who espoused this view was Faye Weldon, who I knew because she'd been an Ogilvy copywriter back in the day. And I think that's a really interesting point, which is that what economists are trying to optimize in terms of GDP style and and tax revenue doesn't necessarily translate into an optimal quality of life.
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely, yeah. What is one thing that you would like to be remembered for?
I think, possibly coming from the advertising industry, I'm fairly attuned to this idea that if you just effectively create a very small trim tab intervention, okay, in, let's say, a decision or a behavior among humans, okay, which is replicated millions of times, however small that thing may be, you can have quite a large effect. And the one thing I hope I've achieved is that if people can consider creative problem solving as a human asset which deserves to exist alongside what you might call rational sequential logic, and in a state that's complementary to it. In other words, if I've given permission for people occasionally to say, what if we do the opposite? Okay. And if that's replicated by, I suppose that's the benefit of being mildly famous. If that's replicated across, 10,000 decisions a day, most of them maybe completely ineffectual, doesn't matter. But I would hope, even though it will never be attributable, I would hope that has some effect on the quality of human decision-making and action.
And that would be your legacy?
It would be an invisible one, if you like, because it would manifest itself in lots and lots of small ways where people just go, what if it isn't that? Okay. My genuine belief would be that if that increases the size of the solution set, or to use Nassim Taleb language, increases your surface area exposure to positive upside optionality. Okay, right? Okay. If it does that a bit, if it just widens the solution set a bit to include less conventionally logical, obvious, but nonetheless more effective options, and if all that happens is that people test those things, okay, I'm not asking them to implement them, I'm simply asking them to try, then I think that would be economically valuable. There's a second thing I'd love to do, which I haven't done yet, which I would like to be my legacy, is I think you could significantly improve the economy if you taught small businesses the basics of marketing. In other words, I totally sympathetic with small business people. They've got a huge amount on their plate. They've got bureaucracy and accounts to cope with. They've got all kinds of short-term demands on their attention. But if they could just spend 2 or 3 hours a week thinking, how can I improve my business and the value it delivers from the perspective of my customer, okay? What are the little things I might be able to do, let's just think of a cafe, for example. One of the things I've noticed is that I always say to cafes, look, put a load of chairs outside when you're open, even if it's raining. No one's going to sit on them, but it means from 500 yards away, someone can go, there's a cafe over there and it's open. Okay, simple as that. It's an ad. It's an ad that works sort of unconsciously on our perception. It must be open because they've left the chairs outside. Yeah. Okay, you don't even do that calculus. We just see it and assume it. I see shops which put loads and loads of posters in the window so that after dark, it's no longer obvious that the lights are on. Okay, I see those kind of things. I think it was Jay Sainsbury, the founder of the Sainsbury's grocery chain. I'm not making this up. His dying words were, make sure the stores are kept well lit. Okay, I literally see businesses which go bankrupt because it isn't obvious that the lights are on. Maybe we should teach marketing at school. Maybe it's only maybe it's only a short course. Interestingly, Annie Duke, who's the author of Thinking in Bets, she's a former professional poker player who's written books about decision theory, also thinks that decision-making should be taught in schools. It doesn't have to be a whole term's worth of stuff.
Yeah.
Just introducing people to concepts of kind of bias or salience or understanding certain concepts that if you make a decision and it turns out badly, that doesn't mean it was a bad decision. It might have been the right decision and luck simply didn't go your way, for example. So some people may actually try something, it fails, they never try it again, when actually it's the right thing to try. So some form of teaching of what you might call approaches to decision-making in schools would be a really great legacy. That's what Annie wants to do, and I think it's a totally laudable kind of exercise, actually.
Rory, thank you so much for being on Last Meal.
It's a great pleasure. It's been a joy. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for coming all this way.
Thank you for coming all this way. And
it's only West London. You've come halfway around the planet, mate.
But perhaps we should eat some Halim Akbari.
I think the moment has come.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Rory always looks at things from an interesting and different perspective. He reminds us that there are powers and motivations at play often beyond our understanding, and that sometimes these motives have merit, whether we're aware of them or not. And that's all from me.